Christopher Smart and George Crabbe are two writers we're going to discuss today. Very different types of writers. Christopher Smart was a classical scholar, one of the finest classical scholars in England. He actually lived 10 years at Pembroke Hall in Cambridge, where he was a classical scholar. First a student, then a tutor, then a fellow. When he left Cambridge, he wrote for John Newbery, a publisher, and he used to turn out poems and translations and humorous essays. But Smart ultimately suffered drunkenness and fell into debt. And in 1756, he really suffered religious monomania. He became obsessed with religion, and ultimately his wife confined him for insanity in St. Luke's Hospital in London. He came out and had to be confined a second time from 1759 to 1763. And then in 1769, after he was out again, he was arrested for debt. And he died in prison. So this is a rather unusual fellow with unusual experiences. Smart was so religious that he would stop in the middle of the street and kneel to pray in his obsession. And someone asked Samuel Johnson what he thought about Kit Smart and his obsession with religion. And here is Samuel Johnson's reply. He said, "His infirmities were not noxious to society. He insisted on people praying with him. I'd as lief pray with Kit Smart as anyone else." Another charge was that he did not love clean linen, and I have no passion for it either. So Johnson seems to be empathetic with Smart. Certain aspects of Smart's life are interesting. Smart was a Mason. The Masonic order developed in the 18th century, and one of the principles is that their members shall never go poor. The story is that when Smart was in debt, people used to give him money to tide him over. At some point, he felt the money was an obligation. And when they didn't provide the money, he would berate them for it. But you will find throughout his poetry Masonic symbols, shovels, various types of construction tools, various images that represent the Masonic order. Smart's wife, after some point of confinement, found that he was no longer talking to her. He objected to her admitting him to an asylum. She finally went to Ireland, where I believe she opened up a haberdashery shop. He wrote several important works: Jubilato Agno in 1759, a song to David in 1763, and at the end of his life, hymns for the amusement of children. Now you have in your text a short passage from Christopher Smart's Jubilato Agno. It deals with Geoffrey the cat. And I would like to spend a little bit of time with that, just to see what it is that a religious person might say about his cat. He starts out by saying, "For I will consider my cat Geoffrey, for he is the servant of the living God, duly and daily serving him." Well, all human beings, religionists believe, serve their God daily. But we're going to be transforming this cat into the image of life and in the image of obsession and religious devotion. Now notice that these lines are very oddly constructed. These are simply sentences. The poetry comes from the rhythm, the poetry comes from repetitions, the poetry comes from imagery. To that extent, the poem is like biblical poetry. Biblical poetry doesn't rhyme. Generally, it's written on continuous lines, and you have to decipher yourself what the poem is saying. And the poem derives its rhythms from parallelism, by antithesis. Parallelism, when you mention things that are saying, the Lord is my shepherd, the Lord is my shepherd, you compare a God to a human being. You travel through the valley of the shadow of death. Well, we don't actually go through valleys of shadows of death, but the shepherd in the Judean mountains would in fact go past a cave where lions might attack the sheep. So you are in valleys of shadows of death. You see? You have the analogy, the parallelism. Then you have antithesis. You look at two words and they're exactly the opposite. And there you know that this is a poetic technique. And sometimes you have a climax where you just build up and build up and build up and praise the Lord to a point where every statement becomes a more a glutinous identification of the Godhead. This is what we're looking at this poem. We're looking at rhythms that are explained by biblical context, words that match each other, words that are the parallel of each other, words that are antithetical to each other, words that lead images into climactic moments of understanding. For at first glance of the glory of God in the east, he worships in his way, for is this done by wreathing his body 7 times round with elegant quickness. Now, whatever biblical rituals Smart is dealing with, you've got the image 7 days in a week, 7 circles around a bride, or 3 circles around a bride, but you have this movement. For is this done by wreathing his body 7 times with elegant quickness. Look at the words. Wreathing his body. We can move our bodies in various ways. We can move them in rhythmic ways. When you see the way people dance, you see how glib they are, how they glide, how facile their bones seem to be. When you see a cat moving, you see its whole body angulating. You see its whole body turning. You see its whole body in motion. And therefore, we have this animal which is the miracle of God, created by God, according to Smart, being the expressive nature of creation. For then he leaps up to catch the musk, which is the blessing of God upon his prayer. So every cat wants to grab something, wants to eat something, wants to smell something. Who gives it to him? Says Smart, the cat is grateful for what he has. For having done duty and received blessing, he begins to consider himself. Now the cat has performed basic body functions of a cat. And now we're going to see what he does in 10 degrees. Now, those who are Masons can interpret and can understand. And those who know Masonic symbols can understand what the degree levels are, where you move from one level to the next, performing certain rituals and certain tasks. Let's see what happens here. For this he performs in 10 degrees. For first, he looks upon his forepaws to see if they are clean. So number 1, you're looking for chastity. For second, he kicks up behind to clear away there. Whatever is past is prologue. He's going to move on. For thirdly, he works it upon stretch with the forepaws extended. How would you like to write a line like that? He works it upon stretch. And you see the cat in motion. Those of you who have cats can appreciate this. For fourthly, he sharpens his paws by wood. For fifthly, he washes himself. And for sixthly, he rolls upon the wash. Each one of these steps has a motion, a movement, a progression, a satisfaction, a source of joy and pleasure. And this becomes the purpose of prayer, to give people a sense of ecstasy, to give them a sense of achievement upwards to a spiritual level. For seventhly, he flees himself that he may not be interrupted upon the beat. Can you any better describe a dog or a cat trying to get rid of fleas by either kicking their hind legs or by bending backwards to bite at them? For eighthly, he rubs himself against the post. For ninthly, he looks up for his instructions. For tenthly, he goes in quest of food. All this is the way he lives. Whatever the cat does is cattiness. It's the way he observes life, the way he explains life, the way he explicates his motion. Just as a human being can move his arms, can move forward, can articulate his ideas, the cat too. In cat words, in cat language. This is not Mickey Mouse. This is not Donald Duck. This is not turning human beings into cats. This is making cats cats. And making them react exactly the way they would without the personification and the cute dwarfishness of cartoon characters. This is real cat performing real cat functions and understanding the nature of the world, the nature of his existence in his cat behavior. For having considered God in himself, he will consider his neighbor. Now he's going to look at other cats. And this becomes Alexander Pope's. First, enjoy yourself, and then self and social are the same. Once you appreciate yourself, then you can move out. And so Christopher Smart is doing nothing any differently than Alexander Pope did with the essay on man. For if he meets another cat, he will kiss her in kindness. Now these are a series of anaphoric statements. That's the anaphora when you repeat the first word, which begin with the word for. These are 4 passages in the Geoffrey poem. For if he meets another cat, he will kiss her in kindness. For when he takes his prey, he plays with it to give it chance. So you see that he is a hunter, but with mercy. For 1 mouse in 7 escapes by his dallying. Well, that's an interesting idea. Some can escape. Which one is the one fated to escape? Which is the one fated to live? And who are the others fated to die? Again, this becomes Smart's life. That to some extent, we cannot know the Godhead, and we cannot explain why it happens the way it does. All right, the computer is frozen for a moment here, and I've got to move on. I wonder if we can get any assistance here. It says, for when his day's work is done, his business more properly begins, for he keeps the Lord's watch in the night against the adversary. Now, the cat at this point is moving, the cat at this point is moving toward prayer. He's moving toward purpose. He's moving toward a teleological understanding. Okay. For when his day's work is done, his business more properly begins. For he keeps he doesn't put the word he in there. For the cat keeps the Lord's watch in the night against the adversary. Now we're going to move on and look at other aspects of this particular poem. We're going to move now to the physical traits of this cat and see where he takes us. All right. For he counteracts the powers of darkness by his electrical skin and glaring eyes. For he counteracts the devil who is death by brisking about the life. So whatever the devil tries to do, whatever death the devil brings, whatever mischief the devil creates, the cat counteracts it by acting as cat, by brisking about life. For in his morning horizons he loves the sun, and the sun loves him. So as the sun arises, you have the recognition of day, the recognition of breath, and the recognition of new life. For he is of the tribe of tiger. For the cherub cat is a term for angel tiger. And now you recognize that the cat is part of a greater species. And the species, too, is explicated by God's will. And this, of course, is his Christopher Smart's design. Okay. Okay, the computer is not moving again. We'll have to move on and talk about some of the other ideas that are expressed in this idea, in this poem, in this passage. Who is this cat? He has the subtlety and hissing of a serpent, which he can suppress. He will not do destruction. He will not destroy anything if he is well fed. So here is Smart perhaps putting in some biographical ideas here. If you are satisfied with your life, if you are well fed, if you are well clothed, then you're not going to oppose or operate in a destructive fashion, are you? Keep following down the page. I'll read some more passages. For every family had one cat at least in the bag. For the English cats are the best in Europe. Now he's talking about Dick Whittington and his cat and some of these early myths that came in the beginning of the 18th century. What about this cat? He is tenacious of his point. He is a mixture of gravity and waggery. He knows that God is his Savior. And this, of course, is Christopher Smart's tribute to the deity. But what makes him particularly useful to God? He brisks in life when he is in motion. But he is of the Lord's poor, and so is he called by benevolence perpetually. He is of the Lord's poor. That means the Lord will look out for people impoverished, will look out for people less fortunate than they, and this again becomes part of the Masonic myth, the Masonic motif, the Masonic address that we find in this poem. No one will go poor, as Smart's friends promised him. Now, that particular episode ends with a rat biting Geoffrey's throat, for he is of the Lord's poor. Poor Geoffrey, the rat has bit thy throat. Just as you think you're in bliss, just as you think you know where hope is, just as you think you know where your point of recognition is, something bad happens. Poor Geoffrey, the rat has bit thy throat. There are always hazards in this world, and it's the hazards that you have to face. But very shortly, Geoffrey recovers, and Smart pays tribute to the deity. For I bless the name of the Lord Jesus, that Geoffrey is better. For the divine spirit comes about his body to sustain it in complete cat. Now, how are you healed? You're healed by the divine spirit. You're healed by the divine healer. This becomes Christopher Smart's ultimate belief, an ultimate statement, an ultimate hope. His religious monomania would only have given him hope, while his obsession gave him suffering. He begins again to talk about what this cat can do. And again, we're moving into the 4 episodes, FOR. For he can spraggle upon waggle at the word of command. Who wrote those lines? For he can spraggle upon waggle at the word of command. Only Christopher Smart. Others would only imitate it. For he can jump from an eminence into his master's bosom. Cats like to do that, and those of you who have cats like that your cat jump toward you. For he can catch the cork and toss it again. Look how detailed Smart becomes. He goes from theological and anagogic understanding, ultimate belief, to the practice of catching a cork. This is instinctual. This is the way the cat moves. This is the way the cat has been created. He is part of nature, and he becomes fun with nature. But he is hated by the hypocrite and miser. Why? Because the hypocrite is afraid of detection, and the cat always can detect a hypocrite. Now let's look at the end of this poem and see where it's taking us. All right. The cat has historical importance. If you look, for he is good to think on. If a man would express himself neatly, for he made a great figure in Egypt for his signal services. And in Egypt you've got figures of gods with cats' heads. Why did they like him? His ears were acute. He was quick. And for by stroking of him, I have found out electricity. Of course, we know that there are electrical experiments going on in England in the 1750s. We know that Benjamin Franklin was experimenting with electricity in America. And here is Christopher Smart like Thomson, recognizing the new science. For by stroking of him I have found out electricity. For I perceived God's light about him, both wax and fire. Now he's using electricity as a contemporary image, as an image of wonder, as a way of exploiting the image of the cat and bringing everyone, both invention, science, animal life, and human life, closer to God. He says, for the electrical fire is the spiritual substance which God sends from heaven to sustain the bodies both of man and beast. How do you explain electricity? It comes from heaven. It motivates, it extends, it develops life, it sustains life. At least that's what Smart would have read by virtue of the scientific treatises about electricity at the time. For God has blessed, now we go back to the cat. For God has blessed him in the variety of his movements. Now this is the idea of plenitude. Each animal, each being, can accomplish what he wants within his own limitations. But he should be allowed to accomplish as much as he can within the area of his limitations. For God has blessed him in the variety of his movements. For though he cannot fly, he is an excellent clamberer. Plenitude. Birds in their area can fly. Animals in their area can only clamber. For his motions upon the face of the earth are more than any other quadruped. No one moves like a cat. For he can tread to all the measures upon the music. For he can swim for life. For he can creep. So if he can go in the water, if he can creep on land, if he cannot fly, but he at least can clamber upwards, you've got sky, earth, and sea as all the province of Geoffrey the cat. Well, it's an amazing poem. Of course, Jubilat, I know, is a much larger poem than this. You only have a very small selection. But you get some idea of the spirituality and the religious focus, the religious obsession of Christopher Smart. Now, you don't have in your book another poem that I'm going to deal with, which is really quite important. And you will find it on WebCT. You will be able to look at the poem on WebCT, or you can find it in other books, 18th century anthologies describing the poetry of Christopher Smart. And the poem I'd like to look at is called A Song to David. So follow me on the screen, because that's where you're going to get the information you need. First of all, when Christopher Smart speaks about David, King David, and he calls this a song to David, he's really discussing the messianic ideal. Because the Messiah, his God, his Christ, is to have come from the house of Jesse. And Jesse's father, David's father, is Jesse. So let's look at this poem. First of all, this poem has 100 stanzas to it. Oh, I'm sorry. It has 86 stanzas to it. 51 is a centripetal point. Each of the stanzas represents a different perspective of David's life. For example, you have King David's attributes. In the beginning, we find out that David is great, valiant, pious, good, clean, sublime, contemplative, serene, strong, constant, pleasant, and wise. Now, once we learn that David has all these traits, then there's a stanza will be devoted to each of these characteristics of King David. So you will have a stanza on what is good, a stanza on what is clean, a stanza on what is sublime, a stanza on what is contemplative, a stanza on what is serene, a stanza on what is strong. We'll see how that works. Next, we have a set of stanzas dealing with the nature of creation. How is the world created? Well, and who is part of this world? You have a stanza devoted to angels, a stanza devoted to man, a stanza devoted to world, a stanza dealing with trees, plants, and flowers, a stanza dealing with the fowl of the world, the bird life of the world, a stanza dealing with fish, a stanza dealing with beasts, and a stanza dealing with gems, precious stones. Where do they come from? Next, you'll move to the 7 pillars of God. Alpha, Gamma, Eta, Theta, Iota, Sigma, and the ultimate Omega, which represents the Messiah. And at each of these points, Alpha, Gamma, Eta, Theta, Iota, Sigma, and Omega, you again have a stanza that focuses on this particular subject. Then we move into something quite remarkable. We move into a series of stanzas that are called the adoration stanzas. And these stanzas are unique because the word adoration appears on the first line in this sequence. Then in the next line, next stanza appears on the second line. In the next stanza, it appears on the third line. On the next stanza, it appears on the fourth line. And on the next stanza, it appears on the fifth line. That means the word adoration is actually traveling one stanza at a time down. And I'm going to show you how that works. And remember I mentioned to you that Christopher Smart likes to kneel. He'll kneel in the middle of the street. Samuel Johnson said I would soonest pray with Kit Smart as anyone. Well, you're going to see a prayer. You're going to see a poem kneel. You're going to see the word adoration start at the top and slowly move toward the bottom. And that is what I consider to be a symbolic act of kneeling. And we'll see how that works. Then the poem ends with a series of statements that go from the comparative to the superlative. We'll find that things are sweet and sweeter. They're strong and stronger. They're beauteous and beauteous. They are precious, they are precious, they are more precious. They are glorious, glorious, and more glorious. Now the detail is to see how this poem works. Remember, it's a song to David. But it's a tribute to the Messiah because it celebrates the ultimate world we pray in and the kinds of concepts we pray about and the things we pray to. So let us look at this poem in a different light. I've already mentioned to you this introduction. What you see here actually appears in a book by Tillotson called 18th Century Literature, and it tries to understand what we find in the various verses of poetry. We find after the invocation that the excellence and luster of David's character are presented with 12 points of view. I had mentioned it to you. And he consecrates his genius for consolation, edification, and there you have the voice of the angels. At verse 27, or it stands at 27, you deal with power over infernal spirits, power over devil figures, and the malignity of enemies. We have the pillars of God, the monuments of God's works, an exercise about the seasons, an exercise on the senses, and we'll move down into the poem. The poem begins with an invocation. This is Smart's tribute to King David and to his God. O thou that sittest upon a throne, with harp of high majestic tone, to praise the King of Kings. So the invocation is really a tribute to King David. We know in the book of Chronicles that David played before Saul and sang songs to Saul. Because of that, we assume that David wrote the Psalms in the Bible. The truth of the matter is, the Psalms were written over a 700-year period, and so David could not have written all of them. But they are given the name, the Songs of David, simply because of the fame of David's origins and the nature of the songs as prayers emulative of David's career. O thou that sittest upon a throne, with harp of high majestic tone, to praise the King of Kings. Simple sentence. Simple phrase. And voice of heaven ascending swell, which while its deeper notes excel, clear as a clarion ring. So this is the opening invocation, and now we're going to find out what David is all about. David is great, valiant, pious, good and clean, sublime, contemplative, serene, strong, constant, pleasant, wise, bright effluence of exceeding grace, best man, the swiftness and the race, the peril and the prize. So he is the peril and the prize. He'll run into problems, but he will recreate the throne of Israel. Now notice up here we have the word great, one stanza, and then we have a valiant, pious, good, and clean. We're going to look at those stanzas that follow. Here's a stanza that deals with greatness. Great. From the luster of his crown, from Samuel's horn and God's renown, which is the people's voice. For all the hosts from rear to van applauded and embraced the man of God's own choice. Now there you have Christopher Smart celebrating David's greatness. Crowned by Samuel, celebrated by God, applauded by his people, the King of Israel. The next line said he was valiant. And here is the verse dealing with his being valiant. Valiant the word, and up he rose. The fight, he triumphed o'er the foes, whom God's just laws abhor. And armed in gallant faith, he took against the boaster from the brook the weapons of the war. So David, glorious in war, valiant, we have no doubt of his heroism, no doubt of his integrity. But we find that in addition to being valiant and great, he's also pious. And we have this phrase, pious. magnificent and grand. 'Twas he the famous temple plan. Yes, David designed the first Hebrew temple. He wasn't able to build it because he was a man of war. And consequently, while he designed it, he could never build it or inhabit it. That was left up to his son Solomon to build the temple. Pious, magnificent, and grand, 'twas he the famous temple planned, the seraph in his soul, foremost to give his Lord his dues, foremost to bless the welcome news, and foremost to condole. You can build the temple, you cannot. You can plan the temple, you cannot build it, you cannot worship in it. We know that David is good. Good from Judah's genuine vein, from God's best nature, good in grain, his aspect and his heart. So he is both a warrior, he comes from the tribe of Judah, his power to forgive, his power to offer pity, his power to render judgment, all suggest that he is worthy of being a king of Israel. Now remember, this is Smart's interpretation. This is Smart using biblical imagery and biblical ideas in order to apprise us of David's greatness. And in order to understand this poem completely, you have to have read the Bible. Now I want to look at some of these other stanzas that seem to give this poem its special character. The articulation of words, the familiarity with biblical text, the wit and capability of transforming images into ideas that enter and transform the poem into not only a text of words, but a text of motion, a text of action, a text which has a three-dimensional value. We'll see in certain passages that come up. Now, we're going to move to the adoration passages. Remember I told you that when David in his piety and David in his power is going to kneel. Well, we're going to see a poem that kneels. Notice line 51. Stanza 51. For adoration, all the ranks of angels yield eternal thanks. They all appreciate King David. And David in the midst with God's good poor, which last and least in man's esteem, thou to thy feast, O blessed bridegroom, bidst. David cares for his people like the bridegroom brings to his feast all the people, rich and poor, to celebrate with him. Next. God has created the world, and David recognizes this. For adoration, seasons change. We understand the creation of the world. And order, truth, and beauty range, adjust, attract, and fill. There you've got the climax. The grass, the polyanthus checks, and polished porphyry reflects by the descending rill. So we've got gems, we've got grass, we've got foliage, we've got all of nature celebrated in the seasons in this particular passage. But notice adoration still on the second line. Now adoration moves in the first line. Here adoration moves to the second line. Rich almonds color to the prime for adoration. So the trees and the fruit of the trees become celebrated. Tendrils climb and fruit trees pledge their gems. Their apples, their oranges, their pears. And Ibis, with her gorgeous vest, builds for her eggs her cunning nest. And when we get in this image, okay, just want to check on this. Yeah, okay. The ibis is the hummingbird. Rich almonds color to the prime for adoration. Tendrils climb, and fruit trees pledge their gems. And ibis with her gorgeous vest, the hummingbird, builds for her eggs her cunning nest, and cunning because she is able to support these other birds. And bellflowers bow their stems. Now, in the next stanza, adoration drops to the third line. For adoration, all the ranks of angels yield eternal thanks, and David in the midst. There we have it on the first line, second line. Excuse me. Okay, I'm going to just show you. All right. Here we have it on the first line. Then adoration moves to the second line. Then in 54, adoration moves to the third line. In 54, adoration moves to the fourth line. In 56, it moves to the fifth line. And then it moves to the bottom in stanza 57. Then he begins again. Adoration starts in the first line. And adoration ripening canes, and cocoa's purest milk detains the western pilgrim staff. So he's aware of the growth of cocoa, and he's aware of the fruits of the vine, and he's aware of the social laugh. Anything that generates gives laughter. Then next, we talk about the laborer who gets rewards for his obligations. That's the second line. Then we move again, where adoration stops to the third line. The wealthy crops of whitening rice. So the field is producing rice. The fenced-in land is providing peaches, pomegranates, biblical fruit, as well as regular English fruit. Adoration is on the third line. Adoration now moves to the fourth line. Everything survives death because it always grows again. For adoration, myrtle stay to keep the garden from dismay and bless the sight from death. So there are flowers that grow in different seasons. Some die, but others can be used to grow. The pheasant, animal life, is celebrated in this adoration passage. The pheasant shows his pompous neck. An ermine, jealous of a speck, with fear eludes offense. So here he is, the pheasant decorated in this beautiful clothing. Adoration now is in the fifth line, and we move now to adoration at the bottom. So in effect, you are genuflecting. The poet is kneeling with the word adoration, bringing it down bit by bit until it reaches the bottom, and then, of course, it moves back to the top. Finally, the poem ends by starting with comparative adjectives, with simple adjectives, moving into the comparative, and then into the superlative. Sweet, sweeter, even more sweet. Strong, stronger. Let's look at this particular episode here. Strong is the horse upon his speed. You see, everything in the world, Smart celebrates. There's nothing that isn't touched by the spiritual world and by our understanding of spiritual life. Strong is the horse upon his speed, strong in pursuit, the rapid glede which makes it once his game. Strong the tall ostrich on the ground, strong through the turbulent profound, shoots Xiphias to his aim. Strong is the lion like a coal. Strong is the lion like a coal his eyeball, like a bastion's mole his chest against the foes. Strong the gear eagle on his sail, strong against the tide the enormous whale emerges as he goes. So you've got a strong lion, you've got a strong eagle, you've got a strong whale. But now you're going to go into the comparison. But stronger still in earth and air and in the sea is the man of prayer. So whether you have whales or ostriches or eagles, all that they represent is not as great as man and the man in prayer. And that, of course, is Christopher Smart's major message in A Song to David. All right. We're going to now move to another writer, George Crabbe. George Crabbe really gives us the sordid picture of life. He's a poet who would deal with the crime news in the newspapers, write about crime news, chase it for television, and give us the worst part and the sordid part of human life. So let's look at Crabbe for a moment now. George Crabbe lived from 1754 to 1832. He was a surgeon. He was also a minister. In 1789, he became rector at Muston and Allington. And then for a period of 18 years, served as rector at Trowbridge. Among his works, in 1781, he published a work called The Library. Another, he produces a work called The Village. In 1785, he wrote the newspaper, the Parish Register, which gives us views of baptisms, marriages, and burials. Now, George Crabbe is a portrait painter. He gives us portraits of all these people who are baptized, who are married, who are buried. And he does it in a way that lets us understand the social satire, the political satire, or the philosophical satire he addresses against human beings. His basic prospect is the negativism of the world, the corruption of the world, and the difficulty the world has in dealing with evil people, criminals, or those who are involved in abuse. In 1810, he gives us The Borough, where he offers 24 heroic couplet letters. And he tells us about Peter Grimes, the worst of villain, who would buy children from foundling homes, have them work for him, and then beat them mercifully prevent them from engaging in religion, and ultimately watch them die. There is an opera on Peter Grimes. The University of Houston performed it in the Moores Opera House several years ago, and it was an extremely, extremely successful, brilliant production. In 1812, he produced Tales in Verse, and in 1819, Tales of the Hall. So what we're going to do now for the next few moments is turn away from the screen and focus instead on the text in front of you. Please turn in your text to George Crabbe. Now, George Crabbe's poem is Iambic and Pentameter Line. If you look at Book 1, the village life and every care that reigns o'er youthful peasants and declining swains. What labor yields and what that labor past age in its hour of language finds at last. So we're going to tell you what the world is about. We're going to give you news reports. If George Crabbe lived today, he'd be a good investigative journalist, and he would be able to write brilliant portraits, brilliant biographies of people whom he is describing and whom he has encountered in his business life or in his legal life or in his ministry. He talks about how people write poetry, how they write Georgic poetry, how they are affected by nature, how they are pleased by nature, but he's going to provide a different view of human nature. So would you please go to line 21, where he, first of all, tells us what others do. Yes, thus the muses sing of happy swains, because the muses never knew their pains. So the Greeks have romanticized life. They never show the misery of the pastoral scene. Yes, thus the muses sing of happy swains, because the muses never knew their pains. They boast their peasants' pipes, but peasants now resign their pipes and plod behind the plow. If you used to enjoy your pipe one time, no time for smoking now. Now all you have is work ahead of you. And few amid the rural tribe have time to number syllables and play with rhyme. There aren't many people like himself who have time to write poetry and fool around with it. Some of you are so busy working, you don't have time to read the books, or you don't have time to write the papers that you want to write, because you've been asked to lay them aside in order to help construct a house or help feed some people at an old age home. There is one person who writes from poverty, who writes from experience. Save honest duck, what son of verse could share the poet's rapture and the patient's care? Now, what he says is, if you try to romanticize this world, you're going to have a real problem. Look at line 39. I grant indeed that fields and flocks have charms for him that gazes or for him that farms. But when amid such pleasant scenes I trace the poor laborious natives of the place, and see the midday sun with fervid ray on their bare heads and dewy temples play, while some with feebler hands and fainter hearts deplore their fortune, yet sustain their parts, then shall I dare these real ills to hide in tinsel trapping of poetic pride. Okay. He's not going to romanticize labor. And if people are being cheated of their wages, if people are being forced to work inordinate hours so others can live a leisurely life, he wants this exposed. He is a reformer to some extent. Look at the bottom of page 40. Go to line 40, 49. No, he says. He's not going to give you these romantic images. No. Cast by fortune on a frowning coast, which can no groves nor happy valleys boast, where other cares than those the muse relates, and other shepherds dwell with other mates. We're getting to be in a realistic world. We're not living in a romanticized world where shepherds can lull by day and in relatively easy fashion watch their sheep. In God's world, the sheep have to be controlled, or the sheep have to be observed, or the sheep have to be understood and then brutalized. He says, no, cast by fortune on a frowning coast, which can no groves nor happy valleys boast, where other cares than those the muse relates, and other shepherds dwell with other mates. By such examples taught, I paint the cottage as truth will paint it, and as bards will not. So he's going to give the truth. He's going to tell us who these people really are. Nor you, ye poor, of lettered scorn complain, to you the smoothest song is smooth in vain. You can't benefit from good song. You can't benefit from good music. You're too hard-working. Can poets soothe you when you pine for bread by winding myrtles round your ruined shed? If I write poetry and give you a garland around your head, what does that do to repair your shed or improve your moral stand? All right. Here joyless, these are sailors. Here joyless roam a wild amphibious race, with sullen woe displayed in every face, who far from civil arts and social fly, and scull at strangers with a suspicious eye. So you have people who are suspicious and people who are strangers, and the world is not so welcoming as you may think it is. Some people trying to plow are too drunk to plow in the morning. Here too the lawless vagrant of the main draws from his plow the intoxicated swain. Want only claimed the labor of the day, but vice now steals his nightly rest away. Poverty, crime, vice, they steal away fortune. The question is, how are you going to repair it? How are you going to repair it? In this poem, Crabbe goes on to talk about the challenge a person has in life when you have to face mankind in his own provenance. Here wandering, line 109. Here wandering long amid the frowning fields, I sought the simple life that nature yields. Rapine and wrong and fear usurped her place, and a bold, artful, surly, savage race. I thought I was going to see human beings created by God. I thought they were going to be faultless. I thought there would be no blemishes. But instead, what do I find? I find that they are all engaged in some kind of criminal act, one way or the other. Here wandering along amid, look at line 109. Here wandering along amid these frowning fields as opposed to laughing fields. Laughing fields are growing, frowning fields are dying. Here wandering along amidst these frowning fields, I sought the simple life that nature yields. He wanted the pastoral life. He wanted the life that the shepherds give us. Rapine and wrong and fear usurped her place, and a bold, artful, study, savage race. Rapine and wrong and fear usurped her place, and a bold, artful, surly, savage race. So we've moved in, and we'll see what kind of race there will be. Who is this race, these weaker people? They are those who are only skilled to take the finny tribe, the yearly dinner, or septennial bride. Only people with advantage. Basically, he's saying that those who labor and those who are in poverty are being oppressed by those with great wealth. And the story being told here is the real story of pastoral lands, the real story of farmland, and the real story of human existence in the modern age. People are fled from the shores where guilt and famine reign. Who still remain to hear the ocean roar? Now, you have but a small selection from the village, but I'm going to read you two descriptions of human beings that we find in the parish register by George Crabbe. First, we're going to meet an innkeeper. The innkeeper drinks a lot, and he's corrupt. He pays highwaymen their fees, and then sends them out again to steal more. He also has no shortage of women whom he cares to seduce. And this is Andrew Collett. So I'm going to read you this description. This is relatively brilliant, and you can, of course, read it for yourself when it appears on the web CT. First we have Andrew Collett. That's C-O-L-L-E-T-T. We're going to begin with this landlord who is big, brusque, fun-loving, criminal. You wouldn't like to pull a deal against him. With Andrew Collett, we, the year begin, the blind, fat landlord of the Old Crown Inn. How do you like those rhythms? The fat, blind landlord of the Old Crown Inn. Big as his butt, and for the self-same use, to take in stores of strong fermenting juice. So he always brought wine into this household. On his huge chair beside the fire he sat, in revel, chief, and umpire in debate. Okay, what about Andrew Collett? He praised the poacher, precious child of fun, who shot the keeper with his own spring gun. So a poacher was on land, he was caught by the landkeeper. The poacher shot the landkeeper and escaped with his gun, and with the landkeeper dead. Andrew Collette sympathizes, works with the criminal element. He praised the poacher, precious child of fun, who shot the keeper with his own spring gun, nor less the smuggler, who the excise man tied and left him hanging at the birchwood side, there to expire. So he praised the fellow who grabbed the taxman, grabbed him by his feet, and hung him up upside down from a tree. Well, of course, when that happens, the blood will ultimately rush to a man's head, and he will die. Andrew Collette doesn't care. Andrew Collette praises the criminal element. But what happens? But one who saw him hang cut the good cord, a traitor of the gang. So even amongst these gangsters, you have someone not willing to go as far as his peers or his mentors. His own exploits, with boastful glee he told, what ponds he emptied and what pikes he sold. So he used to go into the rivers and take out the fish, steal the fish from private ponds, and then sell them for food. We had an episode like that where some fishermen were actually spreading nets at Lake Houston and trying to catch the fish that had been stocked by the Wildlife Bureau. Then they were selling these fish caught by net to restaurants in Houston at a very low price. Well, eventually the investigators entered the case, and the fishermen and the middlemen and the restaurant owners all received strict fines to apologize for what Andrew Collette does daily: steals fish from ponds and sells them at a low price. He sang the praises of those times when all for cards and dice, as for the drink might call, when justice winked on every jovial crew, and 10 pins tumbled in the parson's view. 10 pins tumbled in the parson's view? Well, you're not supposed to play 10 pins on Shabbat, on the Sabbath. You're not supposed to bowl on the Sabbath. But if people are so emboldened to do it right in front of the minister, and Andrew Collette encourages their bowling, encourages their activity, what can you do about it? Those are the times. What happened when he died, this Andrew Collette? On death like his, what name shall we bestow? So very sudden, yet so very slow. 'Twas slow. That you like people, sometimes you want them to die very quickly so they don't suffer. But not Andrew Collette. He deserved his suffering. Disease augmenting year by year showed the grim king by gradual steps brought near. Now here's the death of Andrew Collette. 'Twas not less sudden. In the night he died. He drank, he swore, he jested, and he lied. How about that line? That couplet. 'Twas not less sudden, in the night he died. He drank, he swore, he jested, and he lied. Thus aiding folly with departing breath. Beware, Lorenzo, the slow, sudden death. We don't want slow deaths. We're not going to be able to get to today to get to the story of Peter Grimes. But Peter Grimes is one of the horror stories of Crabb's work. And he describes a man who beats his youngsters, sees them die, and has no remorse. Here's how we describe one of the youngsters under Peter Grimes' care. Peter sought, and when a lad was found, the sum was dealt with him, and the slave was bound. Some few in town observed in Peter's trap a boy with jacket blue and woolen cap. But when they heard the boy crying and they knew he had been beaten, they claimed and they confronted Peter. He'll serve thee better if he's stroked and fed. None reasoned thus. And some, on hearing cries, said calmly, Grimes is at his exercise. And here's the youngster, pined, beaten, cold, pinched, threatened, and abused. His efforts punished, and his food refused. Awake, tormented, soon roused from sleep, struck if he wept, and yet compelled to weep. We read the papers about children who are abused, youngsters who are ill-fed, malnourished, youngsters kept in cages, youngsters in prison, youngsters beaten. No one tells the story more realistically and more horribly than George Crabbe when he describes Peter Grimes. Take care.